The horrifying story of the woman who created a monster, her sexual practices that destroyed her 2 sons. That's what Arthur wrote in his final journal, found clutched in his dead hands in 1958. Page after page of tormented confessions about his mother Beatrice and something he called the unveiling, twisted nightly rituals in a room he named the cleansing chamber. His daughter Alara thought he was insane, until she arrived in the perfect little town of Havenwood, Massachusetts, where her grandmother was beloved as a saint, where her uncle Thomas, a grown man of 38, still followed his mother's every command with the vacant eyes of a broken child. The town protected Beatrice. The church praised her devotion. But those scratches on the inside of Thomas's bedroom closet told a different story. So did the pharmacy records showing decades of belladonna purchases, and the cult documents hidden in the library basement, something called the Elysian progeny that preached hereditary purification through unspeakable methods. What did Beatrice do to her sons in that room? How does an entire town choose silence over 2 destroyed lives? And why was Thomas still trapped 30 years later in his mother's perfect, horrifying prison? The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 1958, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 and who avoided Alara's eyes as if bad news were contagious. She stood in the doorway of her Beacon Hill apartment, still wearing her nightgown, reading the words that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her father. Arthur Whitmore, age 53, found dead in a boarding house in Providence. No next of kin except one daughter in Boston. Please collect remains and personal effects at your earliest convenience. Alara set the telegram on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, waiting to feel something other than the hollow ache that had lived in her chest for the past 10 years. Her father had been dead to her long before this telegram arrived, vanishing from her life 3 days after her mother's funeral when she was 15, leaving behind only a forwarding address that changed every few months and letters that grew shorter and more incoherent with each passing year. The last one had arrived 2 years ago, 4 lines scrawled in handwriting she barely recognized. "Alara, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was the only way to keep you safe. Don't look for me." She had built a life around his absence, carving out a space for herself among the dusty stacks of the Boston Public Library, where silence was sacred and questions had answers you could find if you knew where to look. At 25, she was already the youngest head librarian in the institution's history, respected by colleagues who admired her precision and feared her sharp tongue. She had never married, never even come close, telling herself that independence was a choice, rather. Then the inevitable result of learning too young that the people who were supposed to love you could simply disappear without warning. The coroner's office smelled like disinfectant and something else she couldn't identify, something sweet and rotten that seemed to cling to the back of her throat. The clerk who handed her Arthur's effects was apologetic and efficient, explaining that her father had died of what appeared to be a heart attack, alone in a room he had rented by the week. There was no money, no insurance policy, no will, just the clothes he had been wearing and a small leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling, secured with a brass lock that had been broken open by the authorities searching for identification. Was there anything else, Alara asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice? Any letters? Any indication of where he'd been living before Providence? The clerk shook his head. "Just this, Miss Whitmore, though I should mention there was a note tucked into the binding of that book. Strange thing, really. Looked like he'd written it recently, but it was addressed to you." Alara's hands trembled as she unfolded the piece of paper. The handwriting was Arthur's, but steadier than it had been in his last letters, as if he had taken great care with each word. She said it was for our own good. Don't let her erase him. Back in her apartment, Alara sat at her kitchen table with the journal in front of her, studying the broken lock and trying to decide if opening it would be a betrayal or an act of love. She had spent so many years being angry at Arthur, nurturing her resentment like a careful gardener, that she wasn't sure she was ready to understand him, but the note haunted her. She said it was for our own good. Who was she? And who was the him that needed protection from erasure? The first page nearly stopped her heart. Arthur's handwriting, younger and more confident than she remembered, dated July of 1936. Thomas turned 9 today. Mother says he's ready for the first ceremony. I tried to tell her he's still too small, still too scared, but she says the purification can't wait. She says our Father's blood runs thick with sin, and only the unveiling can cleanse us. I don't understand what she means, but I know I have to protect him. I know I have to be strong. Elara turned the page with shaking fingers. The entries were sporadic at first, separated by weeks or sometimes months, but they painted a picture that made her stomach turn. Arthur wrote about a childhood in a town called Havenwood, Massachusetts, in a house where their mother Beatrice conducted what she called spiritual cleansings in a room he referred to only as the chamber. He described being given bitter-tasting tea that made his head spin and his limbs heavy, described ceremonies where he and Thomas were stripped naked and examined by their mother's careful hands, while she whispered prayers about bloodline purity and hereditary sin. The entries grew darker as Arthur aged, his handwriting more frantic as he struggled to make sense of what was happening to them. Mother says the angels speak to her in dreams, tell her exactly what must be done to save us from our father's taint. Thomas doesn't fight anymore when she calls us to the chamber. He just goes silent, like something inside him has learned to disappear. I try to stay strong for both of us, but I can feel myself breaking too. The worst part isn't what she does to our bodies. It's the way she smiles afterward, the way she holds us and tells us how proud she is, how pure we're becoming. She makes it feel like love, and that's what makes it unforgivable. By the time Elara reached the entries from 1942, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the journal. Arthur was 18 then, old enough to understand the full horror of what their mother had been doing to them, old enough to plan an escape. But his anguish wasn't about his own suffering anymore. It was about leaving Thomas behind. I graduate next month. I've been accepted to college in Boston, far enough away that she can't follow, far enough away that I can start over and pretend none of this happened. But how can I leave him? How can I abandon my little brother to her rituals and her twisted love? He's 16 now, but sometimes I look at him and see that 9-year-old boy who used to crawl into my bed after the ceremonies, shaking and crying and asking me why Mother hurt us if she loved us so much. The final entries were the most devastating. Arthur had left Havenwood in 1943, but the guilt had followed him like a shadow. He wrote about nightmares that wouldn't fade, about the way he flinched whenever someone touched him, about the letters he tried to write to Thomas, but could never send because he was afraid Beatrice would intercept them. He had married Elara's mother in 1948, desperate for the illusion of normalcy, but even love couldn't heal the damage Beatrice had inflicted. The marriage had been happy for a few years, but Arthur's demons had eventually surfaced, manifesting as sudden rages and long silences, and a terror of physical intimacy that no amount of tenderness could overcome. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Elara's mother died, and it explained everything about Arthur's abandonment. Margaret is gone, and Elara looks at me with her mother's eyes, trusting and innocent and beautiful. But I see Beatrice in myself sometimes, in the way I watch my daughter when she doesn't know I'm looking, in the thoughts that creep into my mind when I help her with her bath or tuck her into bed. The corruption runs too deep. I can't risk passing it on. I have to leave before I become the monster my mother created. I have to break the cycle, even if it destroys us both. Elara closed the journal and sat in her silent apartment as darkness fell outside her windows. For 10 years she had told herself that Arthur was weak, that he had chosen his own pain over his daughter's love. But now she understood that his abandonment hadn't been cruelty. It had been the final desperate act of a man so damaged by his own childhood that he couldn't trust himself not to damage her in return. He had sacrificed their relationship to protect her from horrors she couldn't even imagine. But Thomas was still there, still trapped in Havenwood with the woman who had destroyed them both. And if Arthur's journal was true, if even half of what he had written was real, then her uncle was living a nightmare that had lasted more than 20 years. The note tucked into the journal's binding suddenly made perfect sense. Don't let her erase him. Arthur was asking her to do what he had never been brave enough to do himself. He was asking her to go back to Havenwood and save the brother he had left behind. The next morning, Elara called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, packed a suitcase with enough clothes for a week, and drove west toward a town she had never heard of, but that held the key to every unanswered question about her family's past. She didn't know what she would find in Havenwood, didn't know if Thomas was even still alive, or if Beatrice would recognize her after all these years. But she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. Arthur had spent his entire adult life running from the truth. It was time for someone in their family to finally turn around and face it. Havenwood looked exactly like the postcards in the general store window, all white picket fences and maple trees dressed in October fire, the kind of place where Norman Rockwell might have set up his easel and painted small-town America at its most impossibly perfect. Elara parked her sedan on Main Street and walked slowly through the town center, noting how clean everything was, how the shop windows gleamed, and the sidewalk showed no cracks or weeds. Even the autumn leaves seemed to have fallen in aesthetically pleasing arrangements, as if nature itself had been trained to maintain the illusion of harmony. The Whitmore house sat on Elm Street like a dowager queen, holding court, a sprawling Victorian painted in shades of cream and sage green with wraparound porches that seemed to embrace the manicured gardens stretching toward the street. Elara stood at the white gate for several minutes, Arthur's journal heavy in her purse, trying to reconcile this vision of domestic bliss with the house of horrors described in her father's tortured handwriting. Somewhere behind those lace curtains was the woman who had systematically destroyed 2 little boys, and somewhere inside those perfect rooms was the man those boys had become. Beatrice Whitmore answered the door herself, and Elara's first thought was that her grandmother looked nothing like a monster. She was 71 years old, according to Arthur's calculations, but she moved with the grace of someone decades younger, her silver hair pinned in an elegant chignon, and her floral dress impeccably tailored to her still slender frame. Her face was lined but beautiful, with the kind of bone structure that aged into distinguished refinement rather than decay. And when she smiled at the sight of Elara on her doorstep, her blue eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine joy. "My dear child," Beatrice said, reaching out to clasp Elara's hands in both of hers. "I knew you would come. When I heard about poor Arthur's passing, I prayed that you would find your way home to us. Come in, come in. Thomas and I have been waiting so long to meet you properly." The inside of the house was as flawless as its exterior, decorated with antiques and fresh flowers and family photographs that painted a picture of generational happiness. Elara found herself studying the walls as Beatrice led her through the front parlor, searching for some evidence of the darkness Arthur had described, but everything spoke of refinement and careful domesticity. The floors gleamed with fresh wax, the windows sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. Thomas was waiting in the kitchen, and Elara's breath caught in her throat when she saw him. He was 38 years old, tall and lean like Arthur had been, but his face held the unlined innocence of a child who had never been allowed to grow up. His dark hair was neatly combed and his clothes were spotless, but he sat with his hands folded in his lap like a schoolboy, waiting for permission to speak. When Beatrice introduced him to his niece, he smiled and nodded, but said nothing, his eyes sliding away from Ilara's face as if direct contact might be dangerous. "Thomas is a bit shy with strangers," Beatrice explained, her voice carrying the fond indulgence of a mother discussing her bashful toddler. "But he's so excited to meet you, aren't you, dear? We've told him all about his brother's daughter, how brilliant and accomplished you are. He's quite proud to have such a successful librarian in the family." Ilara watched Thomas nod obediently at his mother's words, and something cold settled in her stomach. This wasn't shyness. This was the careful, practiced deference of someone who had learned that speaking without permission brought consequences too terrible to risk. Arthur had written about this same vacant compliance, the way Thomas had gradually retreated into himself until only the shell remained, animated by Beatrice's will rather than his own. Over dinner, Beatrice spoke lovingly about Arthur's childhood, painting a picture of two boys who were cherished and protected, raised with strong moral values in a home where faith and family came first. According to her version of events, Arthur had always been sensitive and prone to dark imaginings, troubling himself with fantasies that grew more elaborate and disturbing as he aged. She spoke of consulting doctors and ministers, of trying everything in her power to help her eldest son distinguish between reality and the fevered creations of his troubled mind. The poor boy was convinced that our evening prayers were something sinister, Beatrice said, with tears in her eyes. He wrote the most terrible things in that diary of his, such awful accusations. The doctors said it was a form of hysteria, that some children create elaborate delusions to explain feelings they don't understand. I blame myself, really. Perhaps I was too strict with them, too concerned with raising them properly. But a mother wants her children to be good, to be pure. I only wanted to protect them from the corruption of the world. Ilara listened to this performance with growing fascination and horror. Beatrice was a master, reframing every detail from Arthur's journal into evidence of her own martyrdom while simultaneously discrediting her son's testimony. The evening prayers became Arthur's delusional interpretation of normal religious observance. The bitter tea became medicine prescribed by doctors for his nervous condition. The ceremonies in the cleansing room became figments of an increasingly unhinged imagination. After dinner, Ilara excused herself to explore the house, claiming she wanted to see where her father had grown up. Beatrice graciously offered to show her around, but Ilara insisted on wandering alone, needing time to process what she had witnessed and to search for evidence that might corroborate Arthur's story. The house felt different once she was by herself, the perfect facade taking on a more sinister quality in the gathering darkness. She found Thomas's childhood bedroom on the second floor, a space that had been preserved exactly as Arthur had described it in his journal. The furniture was still child-sized, the walls decorated with faded pictures of Bible stories and pressed flowers under glass. But it was when Ilara opened the closet door that she found what she had been looking for. Deep scratches marred the inside of the wooden door, gouged into the paint by desperate fingernails, and below them, barely visible in the dim light, were words carved into the wood in a child's unsteady hand. Tommy was here, Tommy was here, Tommy was here. The sight of those pathetic, repetitive words hit Ilara like a physical blow. This wasn't the product of Arthur's imagination or Thomas's current mental state. This was the desperate graffiti of a terrified child, marking his existence in the only way he knew how, creating a record that would survive even if he didn't. She ran her fingers over the scratches, feeling the desperation and fear that had driven a little boy to claw at a closet door while whatever was happening to him in the cleansing room slowly erased his soul. Finding everything you're looking for, dear? Ilara spun around to find Beatrice standing in the doorway, her expression serene, but her eyes watchful. There was something different about her now, a subtle shift in the quality of her attention that made Ilara's skin crawl. The loving grandmother from dinner had been replaced by someone more calculating, more dangerous. "Thomas used to hide in that closet when he was small," Beatrice continued, moving into the room with the fluid grace of a predator. "Such a frightened child, always scratching at things, always marking up the walls. I had to teach him that destructive behavior had consequences. It took years, but eventually he learned to control himself." The way she said it, with that same fond maternal tone she had used all evening, made it clear that Thomas's compliance hadn't been achieved through love and patience. Ilara thought about the vacant look in her uncle's eyes, the way he waited for permission before speaking, the careful distance he maintained from everyone around him. This wasn't mental illness or natural shyness. This was the result of systematic conditioning, decades of psychological manipulation designed to break a person's will and rebuild them as an extension of their abuser's desires. "Arthur was troubled by fantasies," Ilara said carefully, testing the waters, "but Thomas seems to have found peace." Beatrice smiled, and for just a moment something predatory flickered behind her eyes. "Thomas learned to trust me completely. He understands now that Mother always knows best, that questioning leads to confusion and pain. He's much happier now that he's accepted his place in our family. Arthur could have found the same peace if he hadn't been so stubborn, so determined to see evil where there was only love." Standing in that preserved childhood bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of Thomas's desperate attempts to assert his own existence, Ilara finally understood the true scope of what she was facing. Beatrice hadn't just abused her sons physically and sexually. She had systematically erased their capacity for independent thought, replacing their personalities with versions that served her needs. Arthur had escaped, but the damage had followed him for the rest of his life. Thomas had never escaped at all. He was still here, still trapped, still playing the role of the obedient child, even as his body aged toward middle age. The most terrifying part wasn't what Beatrice had done to them. It was how completely she had convinced herself that it had been necessary, even loving. She genuinely believed that breaking her sons had saved them, that destroying their ability to think for themselves had protected them from corruption. She was a true believer in her own righteousness, which made her infinitely more dangerous than any ordinary predator. As Ilara followed her grandmother back downstairs, she realized that exposing the truth would be far more complicated than she had anticipated. This wasn't just about gathering evidence of past crimes. It was about challenging an entire system of reality that Beatrice had spent decades constructing, a system that had convinced not just her victims, but an entire town. That she was a saint rather than a monster. The Havenwood Public Library occupied a brick building on Maple Street that looked like it had been transported wholesale from a more innocent era, complete with tall windows and reading alcoves where dust motes danced in shafts of golden afternoon light. Ilara approached the reference desk with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent her entire adult life navigating the hidden territories of archived information, but the elderly librarian who greeted her seemed more interested in discussing the weather than helping locate historical documents about local religious movements. "Oh, my dear, you must be Arthur's daughter," the woman said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that librarians reserved for particularly juicy gossip. "Such a tragedy about your poor father. Beatrice has been beside herself with grief, absolutely beside herself. She raised those boys like they were her own precious angels, and to lose Arthur so young, well, it's just heartbreaking." Ilara smiled politely and explained that she was researching her family's history, particularly interested in any documentation about spiritual or religious groups that might have operated in Havenwood during the 1920s and 30s. The librarian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow of wariness crossing her features as she directed Alara toward a collection of local historical materials housed in the basement archives. The basement felt like a tomb, filled with boxes of deteriorating newspapers and municipal records that hadn't been properly cataloged in decades. Alara worked methodically through the collection, searching for any mention of the group Arthur had referenced in his journal, the one called the Elysian Progeny. For hours, she found nothing but routine civic announcements and social notes, the mundane documentation of a community that seemed determined to present itself as relentlessly normal. It was nearly closing time when she finally discovered what she had been looking for, buried in a box of documents from the Havenwood Historical Society. A pamphlet printed on cheap paper in 1928, its cover decorated with symbols that made her stomach turn. The Elysian Progeny presented itself as a Christian organization dedicated to hereditary purification through spiritual discipline, but the literature inside revealed something far more sinister. The group preached that certain bloodlines carried hereditary corruption that could only be cleansed through specific rituals involving the intimate examination and purification of young vessels. The pamphlet contained a photograph of the group's leadership, and Alara's hands began to shake as she recognized a much younger version of Beatrice Whitmore standing in the front row, her face radiant with the fervor of true belief. According to the accompanying text, Beatrice had been one of the organization's most devoted disciples, praised for her unwavering commitment to the sacred work of bloodline cleansing, and her innovative approaches to childhood purification. Armed with this evidence, Alara sought out other sources who might be willing to discuss Havenwood's hidden history. She found Mr. Abernathy at his pharmacy just as he was closing up for the evening, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly as he counted pills into small amber bottles. When she introduced herself as Arthur's daughter, his face immediately grew somber and watchful. "Your father was a good boy," he said carefully, glancing around his empty shop as if someone might be listening. "Troubled, maybe, but good. People in this town didn't always understand him, didn't always appreciate how hard he tried to protect his little brother." Alara showed him the pamphlet from the Historical Society, and she watched his face grow pale as he studied the photograph of young Beatrice surrounded by her fellow believers. After a long moment, he disappeared into his back office and returned with a ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. "I've been the pharmacist in this town for 47 years, he said quietly. "I've filled prescriptions for every family in Havenwood, watched 3 generations grow up and grow old. But some things I've seen, some patterns I've noticed, they don't sit right with a man's conscience." The ledger contained detailed records of every medication dispensed by the pharmacy since 1935, and as Alara studied the entries for the Whitmore family, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Beatrice had been purchasing massive quantities of belladonna, valerian root, and other psychoactive herbs, far more than any legitimate medical or botanical purpose could justify. The dates of her largest purchases corresponded exactly with some of the most harrowing entries in Arthur's journal, the nights when he described being given bitter tea that made his mind fuzzy and his limbs heavy. "I tried to ask her about it once," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Suggested maybe she was buying more than she needed, offered to help her find a supplier with better prices. She just smiled at me, that sweet smile of hers, and said she was conducting important research into traditional healing methods. Said the boys were helping with her experiments, learning about the medicinal properties of plants. Made it sound so innocent, so educational. But those boys, they started changing around that time, started getting quiet and distant, especially the younger one." That evening, Alara sat in her hotel room with Arthur's journal open beside the pharmacy ledger and the Elysian Progeny pamphlet, the pieces of the puzzle finally forming a coherent and horrifying picture. Beatrice hadn't been acting out of momentary madness or isolated perversion. She had been following a systematic program of abuse disguised as spiritual discipline, drugging her sons into compliance before subjecting them to rituals that destroyed their ability to trust their own perceptions and resist her control. The next morning, Ilara returned to the Whitmore house with her evidence carefully organized in a manila folder. She found Beatrice in the garden, tending to her roses with the same meticulous care she brought to every aspect of her perfectly maintained world. Thomas was nearby, weeding a flower bed with the mechanical precision of someone following well-rehearsed instructions, his movements careful and economical, designed to avoid drawing attention to himself. "Grandmother," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I need to show you something I found in the Historical Society archives, something about a group called the Elysian Progeny." Beatrice's pruning shears paused for just a moment before resuming their careful work among the roses. When she looked up at Ilara, her expression remained serene, but something cold and calculating flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, my dear child," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle reproach she might use with a confused toddler. "You've been reading too many of your father's fantasies, haven't you? Poor Arthur always had such an active imagination, always seeing conspiracies and darkness where there was only love and devotion." Ilara spread the evidence on the garden table, the pamphlet open to the photograph that clearly showed Beatrice among the cult's leadership, the pharmacy records detailing her purchases of psychoactive substances, and several of Arthur's most explicit journal entries describing the ceremonies in the cleansing room. She had expected this confrontation to be a moment of truth, a breaking point where Beatrice would finally be forced to acknowledge her crimes. Instead, Beatrice studied the materials with the calm attention of someone examining a mildly interesting botanical specimen. When she looked up at Ilara, her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice remained perfectly controlled. "This breaks my heart more than you can possibly imagine," she said, reaching across the table to clasp Ilara's hands in her own. "To think that Arthur's delusions have infected you too, that you would believe these terrible accusations against the woman who raised him with nothing but love. Yes, I was involved with that group in my youth. It was a time when I was searching for answers, trying to find ways to help my boys overcome the hereditary weaknesses they had inherited from their father." She gestured toward the pharmacy records with a sorrowful shake of her head. "Dr. Morrison prescribed those herbs as treatments for the boy's nervous conditions. Arthur was prone to violent nightmares, Thomas to fits of melancholy that worried us all terribly. The remedies were meant to calm their minds, to help them sleep peacefully. That Arthur would reinterpret these acts of medical care as something sinister, well, it only proves how deeply his illness had progressed." Even as Ilara watched her grandmother perform this masterpiece of manipulation, reframing every piece of evidence into proof of her own martyrdom, she couldn't help but admire the sheer audacity of it. Beatrice was rewriting reality in real time, transforming documented abuse into acts of desperate love, casting herself as the victim of her son's delusional accusations, while simultaneously destroying his credibility as a witness. The confrontation that Ilara had imagined as her moment of triumph became instead a demonstration of her own powerlessness against someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. By the time Beatrice finished explaining away each piece of evidence, Ilara felt as confused and disoriented as Arthur must have felt as a child, watching his reality being systematically denied and replaced with his abuser's version of events. "You poor darling," Beatrice said, rising from her chair to embrace Ilara with the same suffocating tenderness she had probably shown her sons after each ceremony in the cleansing room. "This obsession with your father's fantasies isn't healthy for you. Perhaps it would be better if you returned to Boston, put this unpleasantness behind you, and remembered Arthur as the troubled but beloved son he truly was. The confrontation with Beatrice left Alara feeling hollowed out and disoriented, as if someone had reached inside her chest and rearranged her vital organs while she wasn't looking. She packed her suitcase with mechanical precision, her hands moving automatically while her mind struggled to process what had just happened. In the space of 20 minutes, her grandmother had taken every piece of carefully gathered evidence and transformed it into proof of Arthur's mental instability, leaving Alara questioning not just her mission, but her own ability to distinguish truth from delusion. By evening, she found herself sitting in a motel room 30 miles outside Havenwood, staring at the floral wallpaper and trying to understand how she had failed so completely. The Riverside Motor Lodge was the kind of place where traveling salesmen stayed when their expense accounts ran low, all thin walls and thinner towels, but its very shabbiness felt honest after the suffocating perfection of her grandmother's world. She had driven here without conscious decision, fleeing Havenwood like her father had fled 25 years earlier, and the parallel wasn't lost on her. Arthur's journal lay open on the scratched surface of the motel desk, its pages now familiar enough that she could recite entire passages from memory. But tonight she found herself reading it differently, not as a collection of evidence to be weaponized against Beatrice, but as the testament of a man who had carried an unbearable burden for his entire adult life. Every tortured entry, every desperate plea for understanding wasn't just about his own suffering. It was about his failure to protect Thomas, his guilt over leaving his little brother trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. "I wake up every night thinking about him," Arthur had written in 1947, 4 years after his escape from Havenwood. "I see his face the last time I visited, the way he smiled at me like nothing had changed, like mother's ceremonies were just part of the natural order of things. He doesn't even remember that there was ever a time when we were different, when we had our own thoughts and dreams and fears. She's erased the boy he used to be so completely that sometimes I wonder if I imagined him, if the little brother who used to crawl into my bed after the worst nights was just another fantasy my damaged mind created to make sense of the senseless." Alara set the journal aside and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where a few cars sat under the sickly glow of sodium lights. She had come to Havenwood with the naive belief that truth was a weapon that could cut through decades of lies, that evidence and logic could force accountability from people who had spent their lives evading it. But Beatrice had shown her how foolish that assumption was. The woman had turned Alara's own weapons against her, transforming every fact into fiction, every accusation into evidence of the accuser's instability. The real horror wasn't that Beatrice was evil. The real horror was that she was untouchable, protected not just by the passage of time, but by the very nature of the crimes she had committed. She had destroyed her son's ability to serve as credible witnesses against her, then positioned herself as their devoted protector, the long-suffering mother of 2 troubled boys who needed her constant care and guidance. Anyone who challenged her narrative could be dismissed as another victim of the same hereditary madness that had claimed Arthur. But as Alara stared into the darkness beyond the motel parking lot, she began to understand that she had been asking the wrong questions from the very beginning. She had focused on exposing Beatrice, on bringing justice for crimes that had been committed decades ago, on forcing a reckoning that would validate Arthur's suffering and her own need for answers. But justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about liberation, about breaking chains that had been forged so gradually that the captive no longer remembered what freedom looked like. She returned to the desk and began reading Arthur's journal again, this time searching not for evidence of abuse, but for glimpses of the man Thomas had been before Beatrice began the systematic process of erasing him. The early entries painted a picture of a bright, curious child who collected bird feathers and asked endless questions about how things worked. Arthur wrote about Thomas's laugh, the way it bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him and made even the darkest days feel manageable. He described his brother's talent for mimicry, how he could perfectly reproduce the call of any bird he heard, and sometimes spent hours in the garden having conversations with cardinals and blue jays. "Thomas made me a wooden bird today," Arthur had written in 1934, when Thomas would have been 7 years old. He carved it himself with Father's old penknife, painted it with watercolors that Mother let him borrow from her art supplies. It's crude and lopsided, but when he gave it to me, he said it was a freedom bird, something that could fly anywhere it wanted without asking permission. He made me promise to keep it safe, to remember that even when things get dark, there are still creatures in the world that can't be caged. Ilara felt something shift inside her chest as she read those words, a recognition that went deeper than intellectual understanding. The wooden bird wasn't just a childhood gift. It was a symbol, a secret code between two brothers who were watching their world collapse around them. Arthur had kept it throughout his escape, his marriage, his years of exile, carrying it like a talisman that connected him to the boy his brother had once been. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Thomas wasn't gone. The real Thomas, the curious child who carved wooden birds and dreamed of freedom, was still there somewhere beneath the layers of compliance and conditioning that Beatrice had wrapped around him like grave clothes. Arthur's journal wasn't just a record of trauma. It was a map, a guide to finding the parts of Thomas that had survived 30 years of psychological imprisonment. She thought about the way Thomas had looked at her during dinner, the brief flicker of something almost like recognition before his training kicked in and he retreated back into his careful blankness. She remembered how his hands had moved when he was weeding the garden, not with the mechanical precision she had initially interpreted as broken conditioning, but with the gentle care of someone who genuinely loved growing things. Even after decades of abuse, some essential part of him had remained intact, hidden so deeply that even he might not remember it was there. Arthur's final entries took on new meaning as she read them through this lens of redemption rather than despair. His last visit to Havenwood in 1956 had been devastating, not because Thomas was completely lost, but because Arthur had caught glimpses of the man his brother might have been under different circumstances. The guilt that had driven Arthur to his grave wasn't just about abandoning Thomas to Beatrice's care. It was about recognizing that rescue was still possible and feeling too damaged, too afraid, too broken by his own trauma to attempt it. "I see him sometimes in Thomas's eyes," Arthur had written just months before his death. "When Mother isn't watching, when he thinks no one is paying attention, the real Thomas surfaces for just a moment. He looks at the birds in the garden with the same wonder he had as a child. He hums melodies under his breath that I recognize from the songs Father used to sing to us. But then Mother calls his name or gives him an instruction, and he disappears again, replaced by the obedient ghost she created to take his place." The burden Arthur had carried for 25 years wasn't just grief for his lost brother. It was the knowledge that Thomas was still there, still capable of being reached, still waiting for someone brave enough to call him back from the psychological prison where Beatrice had locked him away. Arthur had died believing he was too weak to be that someone, too contaminated by his own trauma to risk exposing Thomas to further harm. But Ilara wasn't Arthur. She hadn't spent her childhood in the cleansing room, hadn't had her reality systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to someone else's twisted vision. She had been raised in the light, armed with education and independence and the kind of inner strength that could only come from knowing deep in her bones that her thoughts and feelings belonged to her alone. The very qualities that made her Arthur's daughter also made her capable of something he had never been able to attempt. She wasn't going to expose Beatrice to the world. She wasn't going to force a reckoning that would only result in her grandmother's further entrenchment, and Thomas's deeper imprisonment. But she could do something Arthur had never dared to try. She could go back to Havenwood, not as an investigator seeking justice, but as a sister seeking to free her uncle from a cage he had forgotten he was trapped inside. She could remind Thomas who he had been before Beatrice began the work of erasing him, could speak to the part of him that still remembered the sound of his own voice, raised in laughter rather than obedience. The wooden bird was the key. Somewhere in that perfect house, Thomas still had the freedom bird he had carved as a child, the symbol of his true self that even decades of conditioning couldn't completely destroy. If she could find it, if she could place it in his hands and remind him of the boy who had dreamed of flight, she might be able to wake him up long enough to offer him a choice he hadn't been allowed to make for 30 years. Alara returned to Havenwood on a Sunday morning in November, when the maple trees had shed their fire and stood naked against a sky the color of old pewter. She parked her car 3 blocks from the Whitmore house and walked slowly through the quiet streets, noting how the town seemed even more perfect in the gray morning light, as if the absence of color had somehow purified it further. The church bells were ringing in the distance, calling the faithful to worship, and she knew that Beatrice would be among them, occupying her usual pew in the front row where everyone could see her devotion. She had spent the past 3 days at the motel, reading and rereading Arthur's journal until she had memorized not just the words, but the rhythm of his pain, the cadence of his desperate love for the brother he had been forced to abandon. Hidden among the entries about ceremonies and cleansing rooms, she had found the fragments of a song that their father used to sing to them before his death, a folk ballad about a caged bird learning to fly. Arthur had written out the lyrics in his careful handwriting, noting that it had been their secret code, their private language of hope, when hope seemed impossible. The song told the story of a bird trapped in a cage so long that it had forgotten it had wings, convinced by its captors that the bars were there for its own protection. But one day, someone came who remembered what the bird had been before its imprisonment, someone who sang the old songs and reminded the bird of the sky it had once known. The cage door had always been unlocked, the song revealed. The bird had only to remember that it was meant to fly. Alara found Thomas exactly where she had expected him to be, kneeling in the garden behind the house, his hands gentle, as he tended to a small patch of earth where nothing would grow until spring. He was wearing his Sunday clothes, but had covered them with an old apron to protect them from the soil, a small act of independent thinking that gave her hope. When she approached him across the frost-stiffened grass, he looked up with the same carefully neutral expression she remembered from their first meeting. But something in his eyes seemed different, more alert. "Good morning, Uncle Thomas," she said, settling onto the wooden bench that overlooked his garden. "I hope you don't mind me visiting while Grandmother is at church. I wanted to talk with you alone." Thomas nodded politely and returned to his work, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his movements became more deliberate and careful. He was waiting for her to state her business, to give him instructions he could follow or questions he could deflect with the practiced responses Beatrice had drilled into him over decades of conditioning. Instead, Alara began to hum. The melody was simple and haunting, the kind of tune that embedded itself in memory, even after the words were forgotten. She watched Thomas's hands still in the soil as the notes drifted between them, watched his head tilt slightly, as if he were listening to something from a great distance. "The lock is rust, the cage is old," she sang softly, her voice carrying the words Arthur had transcribed with such desperate care. "The bars were built of lies they told, but Freedom's song still knows your name and calls you home through wind and rain." Thomas's body went rigid, his breathing shallow and quick, as if he had just surfaced from deep water. The trowel fell from his hands, and he turned to stare at her with eyes that were no longer vacant, no longer carefully empty. For the first time since she had met him, She was looking at a man instead of a shadow. "Arthur," he whispered, the name torn from his throat like something physical. Arthur used to sing that song. Elara felt her own breath catch as she saw the real Thomas struggling to surface, fighting against 30 years of conditioning that told him to be quiet, to be good, to never ask questions that might disturb the perfect order of his mother's world. She continued singing, her voice growing stronger as she saw recognition dawning in his face. "The sky remembers how you soared before they clipped your wings with words. The wind still calls your name out loud, above the fear, above the crowd." Thomas was crying now, tears streaming down his cheeks as memories crashed over him like waves breaking against a dam that could no longer hold. He clutched at his chest as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with decades of suppressed grief. "I made him a bird," he said, the words tumbling over each other in their haste to be heard. "A wooden bird, painted blue like the sky. I told him it was a freedom bird, something that could fly anywhere without asking permission. I carved it with Father's knife before she took the knife away, before she took everything away." Elara reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. She had found it that morning in Thomas's childhood bedroom, hidden in the back of a drawer beneath layers of carefully folded clothes that hadn't been worn in decades. The wooden bird was exactly as Arthur had described it, crude and lopsided, but carved with the loving care of a child who believed in magic. "Is this what you made for him?" she asked, placing it gently in Thomas's trembling hands. The moment his fingers closed around the wooden bird, something fundamental shifted in Thomas's posture and expression. The careful blankness that had defined his adult life fell away like a discarded mask, revealing a man who was broken but not destroyed, damaged but still capable of remembering who he had been before the world tried to convince him he was someone else. "She said Arthur was sick," Thomas whispered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She said his memories were fantasies, that the things he wrote about never happened. But they did happen, didn't they? The room upstairs, the ceremonies, the tea that made everything fuzzy, it all really happened." Elara nodded, watching as 30 years of gaslighting crumbled in the face of a single carved bird and a half-remembered song. "It all really happened, Uncle Thomas, and Arthur never stopped loving you, never stopped trying to find a way to help you remember who you really are." The sound of footsteps on gravel announced Beatrice's return from church, and Elara felt Thomas begin to withdraw automatically, his body preparing to resume the performance of compliance that had kept him safe for so long. But she reached out and touched his hand where it held the wooden bird, anchoring him to the moment of recognition they had fought so hard to achieve. "You don't have to go back to being who she told you to be," Elara said urgently. "You can choose differently. You can remember that you're Thomas Whitmore, not just Beatrice's son. You carved birds and dreamed of flying, and that part of you is still real, still true, still worth fighting for." Beatrice appeared around the corner of the house, her church clothes immaculate and her face serene, but Elara could see the calculation behind her grandmother's eyes as she took in the scene before her. Thomas was still crying, still clutching the wooden bird, and for the first time in decades he didn't immediately look to his mother for guidance about how he should feel or what he should think. "What's going on here?" Beatrice asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern of a loving parent, but Elara could hear the steel underneath. "Thomas, dear, you're getting yourself all worked up. Come inside so Mother can take care of you." Thomas looked up at his mother, and Elara held her breath as she watched him make a choice that would determine the rest of his life. For a moment she saw him waver, decades of conditioning pulling him back toward the safety of obedience. But then his grip tightened on the wooden bird, and when he spoke, his voice was his own. "No," he said quietly. "I don't want to come inside. I want to stay here with my niece." The word "no" hung in the air between them like a small bomb, and Alara watched Beatrice's composure crack for just an instant before reassembling itself into a mask of wounded maternal concern. But the damage was done. Thomas had remembered that he was capable of choice, that his thoughts and feelings belonged to him rather than to the woman who had spent 30 years convincing him otherwise. The Reverend Wilson appeared at the garden gate, having walked Beatrice home from church as he did every Sunday, and he paused when he saw Thomas weeping in the garden while clutching a child's toy. For the first time, doubt flickered across the clergyman's face as he took in the scene, the careful arrangement of Beatrice's perfect world suddenly looking less like devoted care and more like something else entirely. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was living in a private psychiatric facility outside Boston, not because he was insane, but because he needed time and space to remember how to be himself without his mother's constant supervision. The Reverend and Dr. Wilson, finally awakened to questions they should have asked decades earlier, had quietly arranged for Thomas's placement, their belated consciences making them willing to act where they had once chosen willful blindness. Beatrice remained in her perfect house on Elm Street, her reputation in Havenwood intact, but her power finally broken. The townspeople still saw her as a devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her troubled sons, but the few who mattered now carried a shadow of doubt about the true nature of her devotion. Alara returned to Boston with Arthur's journal tucked safely in her suitcase, no longer a collection of ravings to be deciphered, but a testament to love that had survived even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. She didn't place it on her bookshelf as a trophy or a memorial. Instead, she locked it in her desk drawer, a private reminder that sometimes the most important victories were the ones no one else would ever hear about. Thomas was free, and that was justice enough.